Hey guys, welcome to our introductory video on civil rights and civil liberties. Today we're going to be talking about the fundamental differences between liberties and rights. So for this video itself, we have a couple of different learning targets. The first is to differentiate between liberties and rights themselves, explain how our Constitution protects individual liberties and rights, and describe the liberties and rights that are protected in our Bill of Rights that are in the Constitution. So our first question is, what exactly is a liberty? What exactly is a right? And a lot of people will use these terms interchangeably. And they are close to one another, but they do have some pretty minute differences. And we're going to be covering both of these in this last unit for AP Gov. Now, civil liberties are these constitutionally established guarantees and freedoms that protect citizens, your opinions, your property against arbitrary government interference. So protecting you against the government, invading your privacy, for example. Another example would be like the First Amendment, right? The government cannot interfere with your individual freedom of worship, your freedom of religion. So it's protecting you from the government overstepping its boundaries. Now, civil rights, on the other hand, are these policies that protect people from arbitrary or discriminatory, that keyword there, discriminatory treatment by the government. And this ensures equal protection under the laws for everyone, regardless of your race, your sexuality, your age, your gender, etc., etc. And these civil rights are guaranteed to all citizens under a couple of different things. You'll hear us talk about this unit, the Due Process Clause, specifically the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, as well as acts of Congress. And civil rights are important for us to look at because if you remember our conversation about our framers, right, one of the things that they were very concerned about was this idea of majority rule versus minority rights. And the civil rights that we are going to be talking about really serve to counterbalance the majority rule tendency in a democracy that often finds minorities outvoted. So when you think of civil rights, the civil rights movement is a great example, right? The Voting Rights Act we're going to be talking about. We'll talk about something called Title IX for gender equality, especially with education. Whereas civil liberties then would be more like your Bill of Rights, for example. Now, we have to talk about the origins of the Bill of Rights, and I want to start off with looking at this give me liberty or give me death, because we're going to be talking about civil liberties first here in this unit. So this is a famous quote, if you remember, from the American Revolution, and it really is just highlighting the fact that Americans have always held this liberty, this idea that the government cannot interfere with your personal freedoms arbitrarily without just cause. We've always held this in very high regard, since losing our liberties was what initiated the break from Great Britain in the first place, and it's honestly what encouraged much of that Federalist versus anti-Federalist debate over the Constitution and whether the Bill of Rights was an actual necessity to create or not. If you remember, the Federalists believed that liberties and rights of people were inherent. They were just so obvious that you did not need to have them written down explicitly in a Bill of Rights, whereas the anti-Feds were fearful that that new, stronger national government that this Constitution created would actually infringe on the rights and liberties of the people. And they believed that writing down these liberties in a Bill of Rights was necessary. Right? There's a reason why any binding document always is in writing. It's kind of like a proof of purchase of your individual freedoms, right? You have, in order to return something at a store, you need a receipt. So think of this Bill of Rights almost as like a receipt or physical evidence that the anti-Feds wanted to prove that we as citizens of this country had liberties that the government could not take away. So as a result, we see that the Bill of Rights is ratified in 1789, and this includes the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these are protections of individuals, the protections of our opinions and the right to express our opinions, protections of our property. You guys will actually be taking a look at the first 10 amendments here soon, but this is really the core foundation of those first 10. Protecting us, our opinions, and property, life, liberty, property, right? We've talked about that, from government interference. And as I've mentioned, our big focus with that Bill of Rights is that we are protected from the government. So the Bill of Rights is really this physical, living example of our principle of limited government. This idea that the government is restricted to the powers given to it by the Constitution. It cannot go beyond what the Constitution allows it to do. It places, limits or restrictions on the federal government. So I want to end this first video here with our framework, or how we are going to approach this last unit on civil rights and civil liberties. And I want to start off with this idea. We live in a culture of civil liberties. That's very important to understand, right? We can practice or create any kind of religion. We can express our opinions without fear of punishment or retribution. We do have a great degree of privacy in our homes. We have interest groups like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, that challenge violations of civil liberties in court. But that does not mean that rights are absolute. These liberties are not, you can't do anything without repercussion. They are limited when they impinge or infringe on what we call public interest, which is the welfare or well-being of the general public. So if they violate someone else's rights or liberties, you cannot do that action or say that particular thing. You cannot express yourself in that way. So a general example here of how rights and liberties are not absolute: think about liberties of minors, right, of you all. You have this right to drive as you get older to be a certain age, but that is restricted until the age of 16 in Ohio for your safety and the safety of the general public. That's just one example of how your liberties as a minor are limited. Okay, so we are going to be looking at, throughout this entire unit, how our liberties are constantly being interpreted by the Supreme Court. It's not the Constitution that decides how our liberties are interpreted. It's the Supreme Court that has over time decided what liberties we have, how or in what circumstances they are protected, and in what circumstances they are not. So our goal of this unit is to explain and identify examples of how these liberties have been expanded and contracted by the courts in an attempt to balance our individual freedoms and also public order and safety. And this interpretation here, the fact that we can expand and contract rights based on the circumstance, is really what makes our Constitution a living document. So we are going to be looking at case studies of court cases. We're going to revisit a lot of those landmark court cases to take a look at those rights and liberties that have been expanded and contracted over time, sometimes expanding it to promote individual freedom, but then other times contracting and limiting the liberties that we have when public order and safety is of the utmost concern. So that is it for this video. I want us to take a look at some of the fundamental differences, or some of the fundamental liberties, I should say, that are included in the Bill of Rights. So if you need to pause, rewind, fill in any missing notes that you need on your handout, write down any questions, and on the activity for this lesson in Google Classroom, you are going to use your textbook and the internet to complete the rest of the handout, where you are looking at the 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights, and you are looking at what is that? Is it a specific civil liberty for that amendment, or is a civil right? And you will then be providing some images to help you remember these fundamental liberties and rights that we have. So if you have any questions, please reach out during office hours, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.